Good morning, everybody. It's my great privilege to be with Stewart Gordon this morning. And Stewart is a bivocational minister in the UPCSA. He serves Acts United Church, which is a congregation he planted. And then he also serves the Heidelberg Presbyterian Church. And as his other vocation, he is a registered financial services advisor and works in that area and in that field, and that means that he is able to give us some solid financial advice in and around our question for today, which is how do we counsel folk in our congregations who are going through difficult times. Stewart, it's lovely to have you with us, and thank you for making the time, and we pray that God would use you as you lead us and guide us through this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stewart. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Stewart, so let's jump straight in. In terms of your experiences as a financial services advisor, particularly during this COVID time, what are you seeing? What are you seeing is happening to people, to families? And what is the impact, particularly in terms of financial situations?
Thank you, Theo. What I'm finding from my experience, Theo, is that folk are generally often spend too much money, and so they're sitting in a very situation where money's become a powerful thing and it's been dictating to their lives where they go with things. And so the greatest thing I found is people who are basically trapped in debt ultimately, and they're drowning in that trap, and they don't know a way to get out of that debt trap. So that's what I'm finding at this point in time. And it's understandable because people have lost their jobs, people have had their salaries cut in half if they're earning income, and they just don't know where to turn at this point in time.
So would it be true to say that even before COVID, this debt trap was a reality, and COVID has just taken that to a whole new level?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think COVID-19 has effectively shown the loopholes and the gaps as to where we have been leading our lives to. And I think for many folk, it has fast-tracked their financial almost instability, if I can use that word, as to where they are. So it would have ended up there, it's just brought it way forward because of circumstances and just because of their spending habits.
And then because of the rampant unemployment, getting out of those debt traps has become so much more difficult as well.
Absolutely.
Stewart, so in a sense what you're saying is the fundamental problem isn't COVID-19.
No.
The fundamental problem is some bad habits, some bad mindsets, some bad attitudes that we have with regard to our finances. And I think this is really important because obviously we're sitting in congregations. Congregations aren't in a position to give people loans or to bail them out of their debt or anything like that. So the only counsel we can offer is the kind of counsel that changes mindsets.
Absolutely.
And brings about new ways of approaching things. And of course, what we've got to realize is there's no quick fix.
No, not at all.
And this is one of the challenges we'll face, is that people will come to us in desperate places. And we will only be able to offer them the tools that will get them out over a period of time.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, Theo. It's changing mindsets. And one of the practices within our theological background is the See, Judge, Act sort of praxis, which we've learned. So one of the helpful things is to help people to see how culture has, in a sense, led us down a road where things bring us happiness. And if we have money, then we'll be happy, for example. But the reality is that none of that is true. It's just the way the economy helps us to spend more money, to feel better about ourselves, to get into the debt traps. And so there's a mind shift. And so from our perspective, to help people see the truth around the fact that money is a tool that we can use rather than something that we hunger after, if I can use that word.
Absolutely. So, Stewart, you and I talked a little bit offline about the myths that surround money and finance. Tell us a little bit about that, and where do these myths lead us?
Sure, no, thank you. I think some of the myths is that debt is unavoidable. It's just part of life, fundamentally. I think part of some of the myths is also, if I don't have a lot of money, I'm not worth anything at all. And we know that this is the way the world works rather than the way God's kingdom ultimately works. So I think those I now use the word lies that we've bought into. And I think Facebook and Instagram and social media continues to feed into those lies, because you always see people that everything they buy online, but they don't need to tell you how they got that, or where they're at, or how they're battling to pay it off. Just about that, particularly around cars and vehicles, is one of the big things I've noticed people, where some people, especially post-COVID-19, they're wanting to sell cars, so you can drive a car without making the first payment within 6 months. And so people will drive the car, in 6 months they can't afford it, they'll give the car back or get repossessed again, and they start all over. And so that's how a lot of people are being led into believing that, as you example, Theo, have a lot of money, but it's an illusion, it's not real in where we're at. So those are part of the myth debt traps we get stuck in. And one of the things, and we are all ultimately human, we want to keep up with the person next door to us, or perhaps the next person in the congregation. I know from a minister's perspective, often if a minister gets a new car, often the first comment that often comes out from people is, oh, we must be paying our minister too much, which is not the case at all. We don't know what goes around that and where they are. So those are the myths, some of the myths I think we've bought into as a society, which is holding us in this debt trap situation.
Stewart, and then as we look at our congregations, people are in different financial positions. Tell us a little bit about the 3 different financial positions that people can find themselves in.
Thank you. I think one of the situations is crisis mode. That's also such an interesting thing, and a friend of mine shared this with me. You don't know the person next to you and the difficulties they're really going through, because we honestly, when we come to church or we come to community, we put our best foot forward, and we want to do that, and I get that. But a lot of people are sitting in crisis mode all the time, particularly around finances. And so much so that some people sitting next to us in our congregation don't know where their next meal is going to come from. So crisis is one aspect. The other aspect is that sometimes we're one paycheck from disaster. So what do I mean by that? It means that if we don't get paid on the 25th or the 26th of the month, we don't know how we're going to pay for our kids' education or schooling or the lights or the water, just a basic setup. And then the third space is that some people find themselves in good financial shape because of good habits along the way, and so they might have 2 or 3 months savings that they have, and so if they don't get a paycheck or something happens, they're able to continue to function for a couple of months. So those are the 3 situations: crisis, one paycheck from disaster, and good financial shape. But that's not the end of the story. I also think that for us who are struggling financially in crisis, we must never forget that in the spiritual space, we still have our time, we have our talents that we can give, as well as our tithes. And so ultimately in the kingdom space, just being present, giving to wherever we might be from a time or talents aspect, that is also part of using our currency, if you will, to God and God's kingdom.
One of the most profound conversations I had in a pastoral setting was of a lady in the congregation who's was led into an unwise investment. She invested overseas, lost a huge amount of money, was forced to put herself on government medical instead of private medical, and downgraded her life in all sorts of areas, but tried to keep contributing to the church at the same level that she had been, and arrived here one day in tears because she couldn't do it. And then I reminded her that she was the one who was coming to unlock the church every Sunday morning, that she was the one who was taking various people in the Bible study to hospital, and reminded her that she was using her time and her talents, and the relief that brought her when she realized that she isn't just about money.
Yes. Yeah.
And her worth to the kingdom is not only money.
Absolutely.
It's profound.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Stewart, before we talk about spending, because obviously the first thing that one thinks about when you want to counsel people who are in financial trouble is to look at their spending. there's a deeper question that you believe needs to be asked first, and that question is, what drives people's spending?
From the 20 odd years experience I've had working with people and money particularly, is understanding what their needs are, what their wants are, and where they place their value. Because that then explains how people spend money. And so how do I explain this? We all need money as part of the world in which we live, and we acknowledge that. So that's the need. But the want is somewhat different. And so just to explain this in a simple way, we'll use food as an example. We all hunger, and so food is something we need. But for example, one person might go to a local veggie store, and another person might choose that only to shop at a retail store, a specific retail store. That might be 3 times more expensive, but they value what they are offering. So they're willing to pay money for that. And so to understand what our needs are, wants and values is crucially important. So part of the counselling space with somebody before us is to just help them to recognize what do they need, what do they want, and what value they're willing to place onto that. Because ultimately, good food, in this example, doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. If you choose to grow a veggie garden, for example, you can get multiple of food at a fraction of the cost if you value putting in the effort in order to do so. And so needs, wants, and values, I think, is fundamentally important to understand. And this is one of the things, Theo, that marketers and advertisers know very well, and what they use to help us to buy things that we don't really want, but we're willing to do that. Another example, just really quickly, is a house, for example. If you're fortunate to buy a house, the estate agent is taught your budget is X, but maybe for the right house, you'll go a little bit more above that. And that is the tools that get used. And it's a subliminal things that we don't think about, but it's a reality. So just to be aware of that. So what do we need? What are our wants and what are our values that are associated to that?
Sure, it's such an important point. 25 years ago when we moved to Pretoria, Brenda flew up from Grahamstown and she met with an estate agent, and she made our budget clear. And by the time the estate agent had shown her the 6th house that was above our budget, Brenda actually said, look, you obviously aren't listening to me, and so let's call it a day. And we bought our house out of the junk mail.
Wow, sure.
You know, we went through the junk mail, looking at the houses that were being offered at our price.
Yes.
And that's where we bought.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you and I shared a story that I went through where many years ago, as a young ministry couple, we were running out of money at the end of the month. And after a long process, we realized what was happening is that after a tough Sunday evening service that had made lots of demands on us, we would walk home past the local steers and buy takeaway.
Yes.
Because we felt that, and what we were doing is we were meeting an emotional need.
Yes.
With expensive food.
Absolutely.
And it had become comfort food.
Yes.
And that sort of impulse-driven behavior can often be very detrimental to our budgets.
Very much so. Yeah. And so often that decision in that moment, Theo, robs us from the future because we're thinking about the moment. And that's something, just to come back to in the moment, we live in a society of living in the moment, not thinking of the future. And we need to acknowledge that. For many people, the moment that we're in is all they have. But from a monetary perspective, that can't just be that. We need to be thinking of tomorrow and next week and next month and what happens later on. Because if we do not, we are robbing ourselves. And so just be conscious, again, with the needs, wants and values that we take in this moment.
It's such a vitally important point. And many of us have seen the video of the marshmallow experiment, where they give a marshmallow to a child and say, if you can hold on to this marshmallow for 25 minutes, I'll give you a whole packet.
Yes.
And so many of those children can't resist the marshmallow and eventually eat it.
Absolutely.
What's interesting is that they then followed up on those self-same children 25 years later, and there was a clear correlation between those that caved and those that saved.
Yes.
In their future. And this whole thing of delaying wants is vitally important in our finances.
Correct.
Now, Stewart, I'm going to put you on the spot and let's get to the nitty-gritty practicals. So you get a phone call from a couple in the congregation. They say to you, Stewart, we're up to our armpits in debt. This debt is driving us crazy, and we need to talk about that. What does financial trouble do
Absolutely.
to families and relationships? And it's, maybe we must segue into that just for a moment.
Sure.
But then I want to come back to, so what do you do with a couple or a person who comes to you and says, I'm in serious trouble.
Sure.
And it may even be as bad as, I'm not sure I can put food on the table.
Sure.
But let's first start with the impact of.
So again, over the 20 years of doing what I do, I've seen people go from being really financially well off to crisis mode. And it happens in an instant. People businesses lose their jobs. They don't know where the next paycheck's going to come from. And so just to acknowledge that money is a tool. And again, Scripture talks about that. You can't serve God and mammon. So to recognize that the gifts that we have and the money we have is because God has gifted us with certain abilities. And so the starting point would always be with what do you have ultimately. And from a family situation is to recognize that financial stress puts stress on families. There's no two ways about that. And so to give each other space, because when we look at the divorce rates particularly, finance is a big issue on how to manage money. So from a practical perspective with families, to see what we've got, to recognize that we're in financial difficulty, and to be honest about it. Just on a sidestep note, many couples will hide the financial difficulties from each other. And the intention is to protect the partner in a marriage, but all it does is just heaps up the problem ultimately. And so to be honest with each other and to be honest with ourselves where we are. So if we're in financial crisis, to acknowledge that we're in a financial crisis. Obviously, from the children's perspective, if you have children, it's also to teach children how to manage money from an early age is also vitally important. But to go back to your question, I've seen money tear families apart. I've seen money tear congregations apart as well, because mismanagement happens also, unfortunately, in congregations. And I've been in a situation where, by just perhaps the Holy Spirit, I've said something which has opened a door to mismanagement in churches, which then leads to mistrust within a church, and that leads to other problems. So to be honest about our financial situation, I think is my take-home point around what happens to family. Just be honest with where we are.
Absolutely. All right, let's go back to our scenario. A couple is asked to come and see you. They're sitting in front of you. They say to you, our debt is this much, and we don't know where to go. We're yelling and screaming at each other. We're full of fear. We're full of mistrust. We're blaming each other. All of those things. How do we counsel them?
Absolutely. So I think counsel is a really good word. To recognize that for those who are not trained in financial advice, you're not giving financial advice. You're giving counseling. Today, the financial industry is heavily regulated, and so if you are deemed to giving advice, you can be criminally charged. So that's the first thing. Acknowledge to the couple that this is counseling, and to help them to recognize that what you are going to do is a first step along many steps. And I think the first thing is just to help them see where they are. And so many people will draw up what they call budgets. I find budgets helpful in one aspect, but I find what's more helpful is what I call spending plans. And spending plans help people to see, what do I actually spend? Where does my money actually go? Part of that C aspect. And then to judge, am I spending money in the right areas? And so I provided a spending plan for you to put on to those who want, as just a tool they can use. Again, it's just part of the counseling process to take an honest look at where they're at. And so to know where we start is the first thing, and to be honest and to be real about it. To recognize that we are in a situation we are because of our needs, wants, and values. And then to recognize that we might have to make some serious, hard decisions about what do we do with our money and where does it go. And the spending plan will help us do that. And so what is a spending plan? Spending plan is just where does my money go, categorize it ultimately, and to take the past 3 months and see where we're spending money. And in order to get out of debt, we need money to get out of debt. And so what I find helpful with the spending plan, it will show me in an area that maybe, perhaps I walk past a certain franchise on a Sunday evening and I don't want to do that anymore, and to make different choices around that. So that's to see what we do, judge where our money is going, and then to act upon it.
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment there, Stewart, because I think you've touched such a vitally important thing. There's so much of debt, and I'm not so much talking about debt that results as a crisis, but debt that's been coming a long way.
Yes.
Is the result of bad habits.
Absolutely.
And so the first step is to find a way of breaking a bad habit. And you gave a simple example: go home a different route so that you don't walk past the temptation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Correct. I'm with you. I think that the second step, practically, the spending plan was the first one. Let's see what we've got. The second step is not to jump for quick fixes, because debt in most situations, takes time to get there. For most situations. For some, I recognize that it might be an overnight situation. For example, a death of a loved one who was a breadwinner. I acknowledge that. But for most situations, it's been coming a long time. What do I mean by quick fixes? So especially COVID-19 post, there is a lot of promises from a lot of people who can make a lot of money very quickly. And there's a saying that I learned from many years ago, and that is, if it seems too good to be true, there's a good chance it's not true. But they're so convincing, and people have given their life savings, Theo, to chase a return of insurmountable, and it's ended up just being a scheme, and they've lost all their money ultimately. So just to be aware, there's no quick fixes. And one of the things we need to recognize in the church particularly is the prosperity or gospel preaching that happens interweaved. And what is that? It's a sense that if we pray to God in a certain way, we live our lives in a certain way, God's going to bless us. The true biblical perspective is that God calls us to be people who follow God, and God blesses us out of that space. It's a different place altogether. And so, in other words, we are called to be righteous people and live righteous lives. And if we do that, we make righteous decisions and choices with what we have and what God has given us. It's a totally different thought process. And so just to be aware that if I say a certain thing or I pray a certain way, the thought process, theology, that God will bless me miraculously is not a biblical principle that we prescribe to. And just to be conscious of those teachings, which is also part of the faith-based movements.
And Stewart, I think this whole temptation to look for a quick fix or some sort of wonder cure, whether you go and search for it at the church of a pastor who says, well, if you just give me your 10%, you'll see God will double your income.
You're so right about that. Because the truth behind it is that if we make different spending choices, we'll have more money. We'll be able to help ourselves then get out of the debt trap because of choices we've made by living a life that God calls us to. And that is rely on God first. Seek the kingdom of God first.
Stewart, talk to us about short-term loans, loan sharks, those kind of credit cards, the kinds of things that people turn to when they're in deep debt.
Absolutely. So one of the helpful analogies with credit cards or debt or loan sharks particularly is to understand the interest rate they're charging on the money. And so if you just take a look at credit card debt, depending on a banking institution that you're at, it's sitting at perhaps 14, 15, 16% return. And then you need to work out what does that look like over the term of the investment. And one of the things I found very helpful, and I wrote an article about this some time ago, is that if you're in a position where you have any debt, but let me use house debt as an example because it's the easiest. If you put an extra 100 Rand a month on a repayment, it brings down the bond repayment about 2-3 years. 100 Rand a month here, and the interest you save on that is so much more. So what happens with loan sharks particularly, they're willing to give you the money up front, but the interest is often above 20% plus. And so what you end up doing is paying off interest way before you start paying off any capital particularly. And so if you work out the percentage and just do yourself a favor, and those who are listening, just do the calculation. What would it cost in repayments? How long would it be compared to the actual debt that you're paying? And you'll find out that you're paying 2-3 years of interest alone before even the debt itself. And so the advice around that is to not use any of those means as much as possible. If you're using credit cards, some credit card companies will give you 30 days free interest. In other words, if you purchase something today, if you can pay it off next week, it's interest free. Some banking institutions do that. And that is a helpful tool. But it becomes easy also to forget, Theo, as to where our money goes. And that's where the spending plan comes in.
Yeah.
And we forget where money's gone, ultimately. And so just to be aware that the credit cards particularly, and any of those debt institutions, you're funding debt rather than capital. And I've had the privilege in just also my studies to follow other faith traditions. And some faith traditions believe, in their faith tradition, not to have any debt whatsoever. And they live a life like that. If you don't have the cash to pay for it, you don't purchase it whatsoever. But I also am realistic that for many of us, we're not currently in that position. So going back to that family you mentioned, I think to do the spending plan, find out where debt's going, and then find out where's the debt the highest. And begin there, begin paying that off. So let's give an example. Let's say credit card debts, they've got credit card debt, they have a loan perhaps, they have a car, and they have perhaps a house. What is the highest debt? And start paying that off first. But then when you've paid it off, take the savings and go on to the next debt level, and then the next debt level. Because what's interesting is that when we've paid off one debt last year, we feel like we've won in that situation. And we have then the self-assurance to start off with the next one.
Just to sum up where we've got to so far, and the kind of key points is, one is that we need to recognize that very often our problem doesn't start with money. It starts with bad priorities,
absolutely,
bad thinking,
absolutely,
and a lack of discipline.
Correct.
Sometimes. Secondly, to recognize that debt is a dangerous trap.
Yep.
And it was either Einstein or Newton or what. There was one famous mathematician who said compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world.
Yes.
Because it's incredible.
Yes.
How compound interest mounts up. And so to recognize that, and what you were saying about eliminating the highest debt. Am I right in saying that some financial institutions will allow you to bring all your debts together and then consolidate that and put it into your bond, for example, which runs at a lower interest rate?
Some institutions allow you to do that, but what you're then doing is taking short-term debt and making it long-term debt. So it becomes manageable monthly, but the interest on that short-term debt becomes so much more. So you need to do your homework and just have the numbers to be run, so that as you consolidate, it gives you relief now, but you're paying for it in the long run.
But you're stretching it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes that's what you've got to do if there's the crisis.
Correct. Until
you're back on your feet.
Correct. And that's the key thing, is that when you're back on your feet, to then increase those payments so you can catch them up. Final thing, just on the people, I think, that come to you, help people to see what they've got. To empower people. Jesus did that with 3,500. What do you have? Then bring that, and then God is able to do something with that. So often we feel so disempowered, Theo, when we're in financial crisis, we cannot see the woods for the trees. So as counselors, practical tools, spending plan, help people's attitudes, but what do you have, and how can you help yourself?
Stewart, on that point, I remember a good friend who had a good friend who was in trouble, and he sat down with them and they did the spending plan and all of that, and he said to his friend, what if in the evenings for 2 hours a night you deliver pizza, and you use that to eliminate your debt? And this is a person who had a fancy job, but he was in debt. And just coming to your point, what did he have? He had a car and he had some time. And so for 4 nights a week, he delivered pizza.
Yes, absolutely.
And got himself out of debt.
Absolutely.
And it can be as simple and as profound as that. What do you have?
We live in a society here that I think society is looking to the government institutions and even to the church to help them or bail them out. And I think we need to rewrite that script and say, what do you have? Let's help you to identify those things, and then how can we help you to do that better? And it may be through counseling, like you said, it may be ideas, it may be just to encourage people, because we need to be encouraged. And just come on, you can do it. Yes, maybe selling pizzas isn't your dream job, but for the short term, it's going to help you. So how can I help you to do that? On that fact, I have somebody that I know well who was struggling. And that was the question, what do you have? What can you do? What are you passionate about? I said, Stuart, I love doing nails. I said, fantastic. Can we help you to do a nail course? We did help fund them to do nail course, but now they're registered. Now they're running a nail course business as another form of income to help them to get out of debt. And so I think that needs to be our role as counselors. How can we help you? And it might not be financially, but how can we help you to think out of the box so that you can be self-sufficient instead of relying on other people to help you?
I'm going to squeeze in one last question. One of the things I've seen is folk who come to you and they're in financial trouble. And then when you dig in, they have an M-Net subscription, they spend 1,500 Rand a month on cigarettes. When you come to visit them, they offer you Coke. And I've had to say to them, I don't have M-Net. And we drink Oros, which you dilute, and goes 30 times further than a bottle of Coke does. Just give us some comments on that.
I think absolutely. I think it comes back to your needs, wants, and values again. It comes back to those principles. And again, see, judge, and act. See what you've got, judge upon, and act upon, reassess it. But so often, again, we like living in comfortable spaces. And I help people to understand this. We can't take those things with us at the end of the day. They get left behind. I was just sharing with you that I was helping somebody move, and I was reflecting upon their whole life. It was in a couple of boxes, their whole life. And they've slaved away to have that. And so again, to help people to recognize what is really important right now. So if you're struggling, maybe you might have to do away with the DSTV or the Coca-Cola, just for the short term, if that's the situation, to help you get back on your feet ultimately. And that is also part of helping people to let go. And it is a mourning process. They grieve those things, very much so. And so from a counselling perspective, to help people to recognize the stages of grief, I think would be helpful. It begins with denial, begins with anger, why should I do this? Helping people to come to depression, even helping people come to acceptance that for the short term, financially, we might have to give up on those things that we think are really important to help us.
Wow, that's absolutely significant. Yeah. Stewart, I've loved this, and I'm hoping that there'll be lots of questions that we can carry on exploring in the Zoom session.
Absolutely.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you once again.